Okay, thank you, Tanya, and thanks for having me. It's really good to meet everyone virtually, and it's interesting for me to be in an ecosystem of change makers where I don't think I know any of you. So it was nice to see Erica's message just here that you know mapping dialogue. So I'm sure that there are more connections. You know, Marianne, you've heard Adam, and so I think there's lots of close connections between us probably that we're not aware of. But it's really nice to yeah, just meet a new group of people as well, and to be connecting with this community, which I wasn't familiar with. So as Nick said, the work that we do in REOS is essentially convening and organizing and facilitating these multi-stakeholder collaborations around complex and often very conflictual issues. So working in stuck, polarized, uncertain, and uncomfortable situations. What we do in those situations is to bring together multi-stakeholder groups to work on it, which means many different sides of the issue. We're rarely working, even though we work in polarized situations, we're rarely facilitating between two parties or mediating between two parties. We're normally taking this more systemic approach where we have many different voices in the room. And I think that's actually one of the very helpful ways to approach these situations, is to acknowledge a bit more of a multiplicity of views and not only two sides of the story. I was reading all the challenges, the collaboration challenges that you listed in the chat, and you know, I feel the kind of the nervousness rising a little bit as well when I see all those challenging challenges. And just to say that I'm definitely not here to say that it's easy. I think it is difficult, but I think that at least my colleagues and I, we enjoy those challenges as well. There's something about working in situations that some people may think are impossible, and to be helping to create understanding and helping people to see something they perhaps weren't seeing before, and building this collaboration. So I think my colleagues and I are all passionate about collaboration, and discovery and human beings and their interactions. So that's just a little bit of background. But what I've prepared is to share 4 vignettes. I know that Adam, most of you heard Adam speak already, or you've seen the notes from that presentation, so you're a little bit familiar with stretch collaboration. And so what I wanted to do is actually share 4 very specific stories and 4 important but non-obvious and non-intuitive lessons that that weren't obvious to me 20 years ago when I got into this work, and that are things that I'm constantly reminding myself of, and that I think are some of the most important things we've learned. So I'm going to share my screen, and basically I'll tell you the 4 stories and what the lesson is. So here we go. Share. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the first story that I wanted to share is actually not a story of my own, except to the extent that it's a story that got me into this work, I would say. It's a story of which Adam has told many times, and which when I first heard him telling it, captivated me and made me feel like this is work that I want to do. So Adam was invited in 1996 to facilitate a dialogue process in Colombia, in a period of intense armed conflict. And he was invited by Juan Manuel Santos, who later became president of Colombia, but at the time was a young politician. And the process essentially involved politicians, academics, activists, business people, trade unionists, and guerrillas. And the guerrillas were dialing in from prison, from hiding, or from exile. And Adam has written a lot about this, so I won't go into the details of the story, which you can easily find elsewhere. The process was called Destino Colombia. But the message of this story that I wanted to share is that one of the FARC representatives, so one of the guerrillas, at the beginning of the process asked Adam if he had to agree to a ceasefire to participate, essentially. And Adam said that he didn't have this question on his list of frequently asked questions. But his response was, no, you don't have to agree to a ceasefire. You only have to agree to talk and to listen. And that was part of how they managed to convene this extremely diverse group. So the lesson being, you don't have to agree to a ceasefire. And the interesting thing for me about this is that, this is perhaps the most intense story that we tell. It was a story where, it was like, well, we need to agree that we're not going to have arms in the process itself, and that nobody's going to be killed for things they say in this process. Those kinds of agreements. It was, really an armed struggle. But if we think of ceasefire not only in the context of armed struggle, but as as protest, as resistance, as fighting, as naming things, naming injustices and so on. If we think of it in that sense, it comes up a lot in our processes, and the question shows up in many different forms, because there's essentially a fear from people who are not in the most powerful positions and who don't necessarily have an interest in the status quo. There's this sense that joining this room, joining this process, engaging in dialogue with the opponent is disempowering. And so it's empowering and liberating for them when we say, no, you don't have to stop protesting. You don't have to stop throwing pies, in the faces of the business people from the very same companies that are in this process. You can do that in other spaces. But you can join this process at the same time. And in this process, it's a collaborative process in this space. And you can engage in this space to become familiar with your opponent and collaborate around the specific objectives of this particular process. So as Adam probably said in his presentation to you as well, he looks at the difference between collaborating, forcing, adapting, and exiting, that fighting serves a purpose. And often in situations of unequal power, resistance helps to create a discomfort that creates the willingness to engage from the more powerful actors in the situation. But I think there's still so many processes that are asking people to agree to a ceasefire before they join. And in this case, the ceasefire in Colombia came, I think, 20 years later. There was a ceasefire, and when President Santos signed the peace agreement, he actually, to Adam's surprise, cited the Sino-Colombia process as a milestone in the process towards peace, and as the process that helped him to believe that peace was possible, and that taught him that he was able to collaborate with people that he didn't agree with and would never agree with. So this is the first message, and I think it's very liberating that you can actually find spaces of collaborating even while fighting in other spaces. And Adam's also written in his book that the fighting outside the room is what makes the processes all the more remarkable. The second story I want to tell is from a completely different context. This was last year. It's a completely different context, but I was struck by how much similarity there was to some of the most conflictual situations that we've worked in. So this is a process in the north of the Netherlands where we worked last year. It's a region that's been very affected by the gas extraction, the fracking, the approaches of the gas extraction has led to earthquakes in the region. And so there's a lot of resistance to that, a lot of activism, and and a lot of frustration about the kind of handling of damage claims taking a long time, and of the impact that the gas extraction has had on the local communities. And one of the conveners of this process was the fossil fuel company that was seen as the enemy by many local activists. And similarly here, the dynamic of, do we have to agree to a ceasefire, was definitely there in some of the conversations with activists being invited to join the group. And what struck me here, so I believe it was Santos as well who said to Adam that one of the most difficult things about signing the peace agreement was the risk of being seen as a traitor. And in this process, people, in a peaceful region of the Netherlands, they were also seen as traitors if they joined this process where the fossil fuel company was at the table and one of the conveners. They would be seen as traitors by their constituencies. And the important thing about this dynamic, which we also see over and over, is that people are, and I've just got a couple of slides to explain this as well. So often people are invited into a process, and there's a sense that you need to leave your agendas at the door, and you need to come in and work towards the purpose of the whole. Like, we have this process and there's an interest of the whole, and we need to work towards that. And as if there's one whole that's supreme and that's more important than all the other wholes that people are part of. But in reality, social reality looks much more like this. So each one of us, yes, I may be a part of this process, but I'm also a part of an activist group. I'm also a mother in a family that thinks that I'm spending too much time away from my kids. And, that's another whole that I'm a part of. I'm also a woman, and I may have, needs around the representation of women in the process and so on. So each of us is a part of many whole lines, and this is just a fact. It's not possible for people to be a part of only that one whole that the facilitator and the convener wants them to be a part of and to serve the purpose of. And so the lesson from this story is that I realized from this process that I hadn't spoken enough to the people joining the process about this risk of betrayal, and they were it was really painful for them to be called traitors by their groups. And so I think it's actually really important when people join such a process, or when they engage with their opponents, to acknowledge that there are multiple needs at play, and to acknowledge that the courage, essentially, that they have, and that it requires to step into such a process, and to have that conversation with people up front in an acknowledging way. And also, often we see these different agendas as illegitimate, and they're often hidden agendas. We try to hide them away. In this case, the fossil fuel company, of course, does have an interest in what their main interest was, to create some peace. There was so much conflict in the region that they weren't able to have a calm conversation, and so they were willing to be flexible on many things, but they just wanted to be able to have a calm conversation. That was essentially their agenda, and to allow them to voice that agenda, and not to see it as essentially to try to hide it and have so many things that are not being said. So this is one of the non-intuitive pieces as well, to invite in those other groups that we're a part of, to have a conversation about it, to allow people to express what the needs are that they have in the process, and to acknowledge their courage and the risks that they're taking. Adam talks also about this, the double meaning of collaboration, in the sense that there's collaborating with the enemy. Collaboration is often seen as a positive thing, but being a collaborator is basically the experience that many of these people are having. They're being collaborators by joining the process with other organizations that their groups are seeing as opponents. The third story that I wanted to share is a story from Brazil, where we worked with the education system. This is in 2014, 2015. We convened a diverse group of education stakeholders. It was a very polarized system. I suppose education is polarized in many places. But in this case, there was there was a very strong polarization between a rights-based approach emphasizing public schooling, and then a more merit-based approach emphasizing quality education, essentially. And the education system in Brazil had just come out of 3 years of negotiating the national education plan, which had been a very painful process. So they were really, that process had made them more critical of each other, not less. We convened them to develop a set of scenarios for the future of the education system. Normally when we do scenarios, we call the group that formulates them the scenario team, but in this case, they were refusing to be called a team. They were refusing to agree to any collective action coming out of it. They only wanted it to be a process where they would create shared understanding and promote public debate about education. That was the only kind of common objective they could come up with. And they worked through 3 workshops, and over that process, they agreed on a set of scenarios. They didn't agree on their vision for the future, but they agreed on one scenario to avoid, which is essentially the one that's unfolding now in Brazil. And so that's brought them more together. And so the lesson from this one is this idea that you don't have to agree as much as you think. So there are, for example, with the national education plan, they had to agree on a national education plan. There was a requirement for that. That's a political process. And there's, when we have to, agree budgets, or, there are some there, or laws for that matter, there are things that we have to agree. But there's a whole bunch of other things that we don't necessarily have to agree on, but that we just want other people to agree with us on. We want people to, we want to convince them of our point of view, and so we try and force agreement on our own values, when actually it's not a requirement. And what I find is that people often want to agree on the problem. They want to analyze the problem. Is it a problem of this? Is it a problem of that? And I think I'm not sure you ever have to agree on what the problem is. You need to agree on, sometimes you have to agree on the solution. You have to agree on what you're going to do. You have to agree on, like I said, rules and so on. But just always kind of questioning, do we actually have to agree on this, or can we allow for a pluralistic set of views on it? Here, this thing we do have to agree on, and so let's focus on where we do have to agree. This has come up for me recently in relation to to raise a contentious issue at the moment, but in relation to the statues across the world, not only in America, but in relation to taking down the statues. I think it's quite a good example of where people are trying to convince each other of, they want people to have the same assessment of Woodrow Wilson's character. And, so you debate Woodrow Wilson as opposed to debating whether to take, that's a very contentious one. Some of them are maybe less contentious, but that one is, there's many different points of view. But maybe you just have to agree to take down the statue, and maybe our reasons for taking down the statue are different. But we agree that action is the right thing to do. So this I find really important, and again, I find people find it quite liberating when we say you don't have to agree to be a part of this process. You don't have to agree with your opponents, you just have to engage with them. The final process is a process called the Sustainable Oceans Lab, which we ran in 2014, 2015. Here we brought together a very diverse group of ocean stakeholders, including local fishermen, traditional leaders, but also corporations, and intergovernmental organizations, and academics, and nonprofit organizations, and so on. And there was lots of disagreements in this group that have to do with the oceans, primarily around sort of ocean sustainability on the one hand, and then ocean economy on the other hand. But the example, or the vignette I want to share with you, is actually not about the ocean tensions. It's about a race issue that came up in the group. So there was a group of, basically there were 5 gray-haired white men in the group. It was a very diverse group, but there were 5 of them, and they were actually all a part of the same team, same subgroup within the process. They were working together, and there were just kind of recurring jokes about the old white men that were happening. It was the first time maybe it was funny, but then it kept being repeated, and primarily coming from women in the group. And at one point we needed to just pause and say, how do you guys feel about, like, we noticed this joke's been coming up multiple times. How does it make you feel? What are you noticing? And I'm saying, well, actually, I thought it was sort of funny the first time, but now I really feel hurt by it. In the group, in that same group with the 5 white men, there was actually a Black woman who was in the same group. And the group was being called the white men's group. And she was like, well, who am I then? Am I invisible, in this group? And so her expressing what she was experiencing in that came into the process. And it was a really important moment of the group coming together and bringing something to the surface that was under the surface, that wasn't about the substance we were talking about, but it was holding us back, and it was fraying the relationships in the group, and it was making it more difficult to collaborate. And just having the conversation, bringing it to the surface, inviting people to share their feelings without us lecturing them as facilitators, but inviting them to share their feelings, and then asking the group, so how do you want to be together, given what you've heard here? And then having them agree to move forward in a different way. It was, I think it was a turning point in the process. And again, even though the process was about oceans, I think if you speak to people who were in the process now, 4 years later, I think they would still say that this was a turning point, or one of the things where they learned the most in this process. So the lesson that I wanted to share from that is that conflict, if embraced, it can be a source of wisdom. That there's very often conflicts under the surface, and in this case, we raised it to the surface early. It could have become much more damaging if we had allowed it to simmer and to intensify. But noticing where the conflicts are as early as possible, and raising them from the beginning, or even naming the conflicts that are normalizing conflict. So, even acknowledging up front that given the composition of this group, we can expect that there will be conflict. Then you normalize it, you make it something that's here with us, and that we can embrace, and that we have the capabilities to work with. And then everybody learns. So that's what I wanted to share with you. 4 stories and 4 lessons that really guide me in my work, and I hope there's something useful in that for all of you as well.
Thanks so much, Mille. Just an amazing journey. Oh, I'm wondering if you could
stop sharing.
Put us back, so we can all see one another again. I have numerous questions, but what I'd love to do is if I'm hoping that people have some questions, and if you could put them into the chat, um, that would be really great. And Mille will give you a chance to interact with our change community here. So if something came up during Mille's presentation, please jump in. There was a lot of interesting chat, quite a lot about hold-ons. And then
Yeah, I couldn't see the chat while I was presenting, so I don't know.
Yeah, that's all right.
That's right. I didn't say that a hold-on is simultaneously a hold and a part, so thanks for clarifying that, Erica.
Erica has a question. How will the role of virtual spaces play now in such conflict processes, taking into account aspects like the digital divide?
Well, the digital divide piece, I think, is interesting. We've actually had really good experiences in during this lockdown with virtual processes that we had planned, including in places like Mali and Syria, and people have managed. People even inside Syria managed to get on Zoom, which surprised me. And people in Mali, we provided them with dial-in modems so that they could access. So I think there is a digital divide in terms of everything being on the virtual, but I also think there's something exciting about the need for these virtual processes. I think is also, or at least with the stakeholders that we work with. So I haven't studied this, but I think it's empowered people that in our processes that weren't otherwise having access to these tools to get on them and work with them. We've been talking a lot about the virtual work because obviously we're doing a lot of it at the moment in REOS, and yeah, I think it's really interesting how it's a completely different power dynamic in the virtual space. When you work with when we work with the virtual whiteboards, when we work in the virtual space, also like some of the younger people are much more empowered than the older generation. So there's different new power dynamics in that sense. But it's definitely, I think, the relational level, not having the informal spaces where people are having dinner together, where they're having lunch together, where they're over tea break, connecting in other ways. There's definitely a relational cost to it. So
Could I pose a question, Mille? And it's actually a combination of a curiosity I have and also something that Ailish posted really early on in your talk, and that was Ailish wrote while you were talking about the sense of people being traitors, that Ailish being from Ireland, she said the same happened to Michael Collins when he signed the peace treaty here in Ireland. He was assassinated.
yeah.
And I was curious about the effect that the role of the host of the collaboration has on the collaboration. Mm-hmm. In a sense, your client. Because if the host is, if they bring in the the collaboration team, does that have a big influence on who will join and how they feel about it?
Right. Yeah, so we talk about the host as the convener, and often it's a convening alliance. So it affects everything. Who convenes affects who comes in, and if if that convening group isn't seen as legitimate, then there will be voices missing, or if it's not seen as balanced, then there will be voices missing, and who's in the room then influences everything. There's even been some cases where we felt that we had a relatively balanced group, but then we've realized afterwards that no, actually this group was too much on one side, and voices that weren't included don't see the work as legitimate. So it's hugely important who convenes and therefore who's in the room. In some cases, the way we get around it is by creating a balanced convening alliance. So in this Brazil process, for example, which was extremely polarized, we had the two groups convening together, and actually the facilitation of the convening alliance was harder even than the facilitation of the bigger group. But because that work was done at the center of the initiative, everybody in the system could identify someone that they could relate to in the convening alliance, and therefore they came in and they would say, okay, well, you invite these people and you invite those people, and they manage to do it together. So sometimes you need a neutral or impartial convening organization, or you need a balanced convening alliance, which may mean two sides convening together.
I'm going to combine two questions that have come up again. Maria said, she asked, what about power unbalance? Some people have much more to lose than others. And then Saranj said, last week we learned that wealth of 75% of the world's richest has grown rapidly through the times of the pandemic, even as millions have lost jobs. When inequality increases to such an extent, how do you create any conversation between these groups when there's nothing on the table for one group? So in a sense, both those are about power imbalance and inequality.
Mm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, let me see. I mean, there's the power is a huge factor in these processes, and I'm not sure that we undo it completely, but so part of it again is coming into the process, and part of it is how you facilitate once people are in the room. So how do you get a balance of power to participate, and then how do you equalize once you're facilitating the process? In terms of people coming in, I find that the harder group to get in is the ones that have the biggest interest in the status quo. So the most powerful, who don't want change, are the least likely to participate. The people who do want change will tend to join, as long as we build a trust with them that that we will facilitate in this equal way. So that their voices will be included, and yeah, that everyone will be equal in the process itself. And there's a lot of ways of doing that. We have a principle called democracy of time, in terms of people speaking, taking up equal amounts of time, asking people in the evaluations, like, do you feel your voice is included? Just really trying to constantly bring things to the surface and show that there's an objective of the process of equal participation. But I mean, and then the idea is that spreads to these wider systems. But of course, yeah, I mean, there are limitations to. I mean, we are living in very stuck systems in that sense. But I would say the most transformative moments in our processes often are more powerful players transforming. So, for example, someone from a multinational company saying, I realized I haven't been listening the past 20 years, for example. Those kinds of transformations that happen, and the experience of an equal process, it's a very rare experience. So having that experience is very powerful.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mille. The questions have slowed down in the chat. I'm sure there are many, but it's actually good timing, because at this point we want to take this whole experience of your opening this for us, Mille, and open the space. And I just want to thank you again, Mille. It's such a fascinating journey, and I can understand very much how you would have to keep reminding yourself about these 4 rules. You don't have to agree to a ceasefire, acknowledge the Holland's agendas and the risk of betrayal, and you don't have to agree as much as you think. And conflict, if embraced, can be a source of wisdom. I can see them as being incredibly wise and knowledgeable, and I can also see myself instinctively not doing them. So thank you again for this, and from everybody, I'm sure. And I know you may have to check out shortly, but really
Yeah.
appreciate your being here with us.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I would love to stay for the open space, but I have 3 kids upstairs who are needing entertainment, so I'm gonna have to drop off. It is a Saturday, but I was really pleased to be here, and feel free to reach out if you have further questions or thoughts.
Okay. Thanks, Mille.
Thank you.